Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Chasing Frets, and I'm joined this week by my good buddy Joe Gore. How you doing, Joe?
I'm doing great, and especially stoked about our guest this week. It's the fabulous Richard Fortus.
Yeah, and right when we were first putting this whole podcast together, he was one of the names that you offered out there, and a lot of people know him from his 20 now years, close to, playing in Guns N' Roses and involved with them. But he also has quite a deep history with Psychedelic Furs.
And he was a session player of note earlier in his career, and just interesting dude. Also, he grew up in the musical instrument industry. His dad was one of the guys who ran St. Louis Music back when he was a kid, so he's sort of a guitar lifer,
Mm-hmm. And he played violin as a kid, did the Suzuki thing, and the whole deal.
Cello too. Don't you hate him? He's the sweetest, most down to earth guy in the world, and as you'll see, he's just a delight.
Yeah. So today's episode, we're going to talk about. He produced the new Psychedelic Furs record,
which just came out like a couple days ago.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about his history with that band, which goes back until like he was like 15 or 16. Is when he first started even opening for them, as he tells the story. And he also gives some backstory on how the Guns N' Roses gig came together.
Yeah, he's very forthcoming about the Guns N' Roses situation. It's there's some really interesting little tidbits you'll pick up as you listen.
Yeah, so we're going to hit that episode today, and we're going to have Richard back all the rest of this week. So let's jump right to our conversation with Richard Fortus.
Hey, Richard, thanks for joining us today. We've really been looking forward to hanging out with you. One thing that Jason and I were thinking about is that more than once in your career, you've had the position of stepping in and being the guitarist with artists who have a long legacy, a well-defined sound, intense relationship with their fans, and a pretty heavy audience expectation about what they want to hear. And we were wondering if you talk about how you strike the balance between honoring the tradition and meeting audience expectations while also being true to yourself. And this is obviously with Guns N' Roses, and you've been playing with Richard Butler from Psychedelic Furs for decades, but not in the very original version in the band. And when we were talking before the interview, you mentioned another notable example, which I'll let you talk about. But you found yourself in that position more than once. Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me, guys. I'm flattered to be here. I started out with my own band, and originally got signed to a record label, and we built up a big Midwest following, and we kept expanding and moving further and further out. So we go to I'm from St. Louis, and we would start playing all the college towns around. So Columbia, Missouri, in Illinois, Carbondale, and Springfield, Missouri, and then Indiana and Chicago, just sort of pushing out further and further. I was, and it was really, I think I had somehow become the driving force of that band, in songwriting. It was myself and the singer. And so
are we talking about we're talking about the Dead Daisies?
No. This is a band called Pale Divine.
Okay.
This is when I was a kid, 15 years old, my first band. And we signed with Atlantic Records and ended up touring, supporting the Furs, and who were one of my favorite bands. I saw them first when I was, I guess, like 15 on the Forever Now tour. And we toured supporting them. And then they found out I played violin and cello, and they started inviting me up to play with them after our set. So that's how I sort of got in with that band. I became friends with Richard and with Knox Chandler, as well as John Ashton. And so then Richard was going to do a solo album after that record, and asked me if I would want to come up to New York and write with him. And that's when I moved to New York, and what ended up becoming two Love Spit Love albums, and not a solo album, because it was Richard and I really writing the entire thing. And we got to the end of it and he said, I don't feel comfortable calling this a solo album. So that was, again, that was my baby. That was, he and I wrote the songs. And then he asked me to co-produce the second album with him and Ben Gross. And then he ended up putting the Furs back together and touring. And I was a second guitarist with John. And then eventually took over for John as well when they had a falling out, and for a brief period. It's a tricky thing when you're coming into, because you want to bring your own character to it, to the role, to those songs, but you have to really have some reverence for the song and the original parts. And so it's a fine line. It's a delicate balance that you walk between your own personality and honoring the originality of the song to begin with, and the same with Guns. Coming into, especially with Guns, because fans are so attached to the Appetite album. There's not a lot of room for bringing your own thing, but it really has, especially since Slash has come back, there's a lot more openness and room for me to inject myself in. And but I was mentioning before that the biggest honor for me was when I was asked to join Thin Lizzy, because that was a band that I grew up listening to and was very important to me and really helped develop my ideals of what the perfect rock guitar tone was. And, it all sort of, I was very indebted to them. And it was a great thrill to be able to play guitar harmonies with Scott Gorham. That was a huge thing for me. And in that instance, I really wanted to, because it's so intricate, the parts are, and how you play together, I really spent a lot of time copying Brian's vibrato, Robertson's vibrato, as well as Gary Moore, and really sort of honing that in, because they really would match their vibrato, which was, I thought, really cool. And I wanted to nail that. And then I showed up to rehearsal in Ireland with those guys, and Scott had a Les Paul with a Floyd Rose on it, and was doing his vibrato with the bar. And I was like, whoa, dude, you're messing up the whole thing here. It was really, it was difficult I had to adapt on the fly to that. But man, what a blast that was to do that tour.
You're talking about the vibrato, and it's not often that I hear a guitarist say something about matching the vibrato, but also, you grew up playing bowed string instruments, and you're playing in a section where matching the vibrato is your daily business.
That's right. Essential. Yeah. And on those records, like, you listen to Live and Dangerous, and you can tell they spent a lot of time working that stuff out. It sort of all went out the window. But
which is your favorite? What was your favorite Thin Lizzy song to play?
Probably Black Rose. The Gary Moore parts are just so intense, so great. God, what an amazing player.
Can you tell us a little bit about how your kind of backstory getting into the Guns N' Roses gig?
Okay, this is an interesting one. I was actually called, I was doing a lot of sessions in New York, and was sort of like one of the guys in New York as far as like rock guitar players that you go to. I'd always been more like of a alternative type of music guy. And so I was surprised, but I got a call from Guns N' Roses asking if I'd be interested in auditioning. And I said, well, yeah, I'm going to be out there in a couple of weeks doing an album, and I'd be happy to come out and audition then. And they're like, oh, that's perfect. That's going to work out great timing wise. And we spoke back and forth. They sent me songs to learn. And then a few days before, I'm like, I hadn't been hearing back from them for like a week. And so I'm calling, and I wasn't getting any call back. So I thought, okay, well, I guess that's not happening. And then I still go out there to do this album that I was scheduled to do. And on the session, was Tommy Stinson and Josh Freese, who were both in GNR at that time. And so I was like, oh, this is crazy. I was supposed to come out and audition for you guys. And it was the first time I'd met either of them. And they were like, oh, you're the guy from New York. Man, Axl found this guy Buckethead and called off all the rest of the auditions. And I was like, okay, cool. And Tommy and I went out that night and became best friends. And like, we've been, super close ever since then. And that was my first experience. I didn't get to audition, but then a couple of years later, maybe a year and a half later, they were looking for somebody again, because there was a guitar player that played a couple of shows with them that was named Paul, that was Axl's childhood friend that had come in. And he left, so they were looking for somebody to fill that role. So they called me again. And I was actually in the middle of a tour in Europe, and I had 2 days off. So I flew into LA and did the audition, got back on a plane and went back, finished the tour. But yeah, that was my entrance.
I believe you're the only person who survived both the Axl-only version of Guns N' Roses with Buckethead and Brain and Tommy and Robin, but then also played in the proper Guns N' Roses, where you're the only new guy among the all original band. That sounds like
not true.
Okay, thank you.
Dizzy Reed, the keyboard player.
Okay,
he's been there. He's been there the whole time.
Can you compare the experience between the two versions of the band?
No, you can't. I mean, literally, you can't. It's two completely different things. Completely different things. Just the overall vibe, everything about it is different. The experience of playing, of being on stage, and that chemistry that, there really wasn't much of a chemistry. There was for a brief moment with Robin. After Bucket left for a minute there, it was just Robin and myself, and we were doing rehearsals in Brain, and it was phenomenal. I mean, absolutely amazing. And literally, I think it was 2 days before we were supposed to do our first show, everyone was just, the energy was palpable. I mean, everybody that was in the room was like, you knew something was happening. I mean, it was electric. It was really outstanding. And I'd never had that feeling before of like, oh my God, this is incredible. Axl came down, was just, I mean, he was like, this is the band I've always wanted. The next day, Bumblefoot comes in, and I guess, Axl they'd found this guy, and he came in, and the whole dynamic just completely shifted. So, but the vibe in the band now it's even beyond what that ever was. It's really incredible. Slash is just such an incredibly natural musician. And it's just, there's a reason why he is the legend he is.
Can you talk a little bit about how, kind of musically speaking, the parts you play, how they have kind of progressed between the various iterations of Guns?
That's a good question. Yeah, it's been very interesting because, as different players come and go, my parts morph and change to cover different parts. So it's constantly evolving. Obviously when Slash came in, the parts of his that I was playing,
right, yeah,
I wasn't going to be playing anymore. His parts. But he's been incredibly gracious with me as a player. And it's when he first started, was coming back, mutual friends of ours were like, man, good luck getting beyond the 5th fret. But I have not experienced that at all. He's been incredibly gracious and really an inspiration to play with, and it's very competitive in a very, very friendly, same team type of way, like always pushing each other, which I am flattered to be in that role, and for him to welcome it.
To build on Joe's question he asked you before, what's your favorite Guns song to play live? When you see it on the set list, you're like, no matter what, that's the song I'm looking forward to the most.
Generally, it's the newest one.
Like newest to the set list, or newly created?
Newest to
Okay, yeah.
to the set list, yeah. To us. Consistently, we did, Slash and I did this duet for a long time while they would get the piano in place to do November Rain. The two of us would do, and this happened at sound check of the first show. And Axel had a broken leg. So it was the first arena show. We played a club show where he broke his foot and was in a cast and in a chair. And we were at sound check trying to figure how the hell we were going to do this, like how we were going to pull this off with our front man now in a chair, how we were going to pull this off. And the question of, okay, how do we get the piano up? And this is going to take time because then we got to wheel him out to the piano. And at that point, he's like, you guys got to do something while we get this all in place. So Slash looks at me, he's like, what do you want to play? And I'm like, I have no idea. He's like, what about Wish You Were Here? And I was like, sure, let's try it. So the two of us sound check, he started playing it and I played the vocal melody, because it's got to be there, right? And then we just went back and forth over the progression, trading solos, and the band comes in, and we did this just off the cuff at sound check. And the crew, which is the most hardened bunch of pirates you'd ever come across, and are incredibly unimpressed by anything, stopped and applauded. It was just magical. It was just like one of those. And so we did that. We did that for 2 or 3 years in the show. And that was my favorite thing because it was different every night, and there's a few things like that, like Heaven's Door is different every night. We never, it's just, there's this big open section and we don't know what's going to happen. And it's, and man, one thing, and this is a real testament to the legend that is Slash, he never plays the same thing twice in situations like that. And, as a guitar player, you sort of fall into your ruts, don't you? You get into your lead that you like, or that you feel, your licks that you feel comfortable with in that song. And
I have no idea what you mean. That never happens.
I know, but for us,
no, I'm being sarcastic. Of course, everybody does that almost.
He doesn't,
yeah.
And I love that. So it makes me not be able to do it, and I and so it's that. That's what I mean by that, like competitive. Like we push each other because we don't want to fall back and rest on our laurels. We want to and because he does it, and I'll say this. I've said this before about him. He comes out every night and does a guitar solo. Axel introduces him, and he just plays. And a lot of times you
mean solo with no accompaniment, just
by himself.
Yeah.
Walks to the front of the stage and just plays. I've never heard him repeat himself.
How can we get a whole album of that? How can we just get the board tapes for all for the solos? And
I'll be honest, man. Sometimes it is the hair on my arms is standing up, and it's hard to, because sometimes we'll come in with a progression behind him, and he'll sort of lead it, and there's times when it's very difficult for me to focus on what I'm doing because I'm listening to him, and it's just awe-inspiring. And some nights are not magical. Some nights, you're like, ooh, but overall, his musicality, and I think that's the sign of real genius. I mean, you listen to Jeff Beck, and one night he is the greatest player ever, and then the next night, is not so great. And Hendrix, like every show was so different. I don't know if you remember, they released a box set of like 4 different concerts with Hendrix over the course of 4 years, and each set was a lot of the same songs, completely different versions. I mean, he played completely different. That's genius. You listen to bootlegs of Hendrix, and on the same tour within different nights, he just completely played different things and approached the song completely differently. I love that. I love that.
I think as far as like as anthemic and iconic as all the parts and solos he played on those records, that tends to like make me think that Slash is a very underrated improviser.
Absolutely.
Because
absolutely
that kind of output you only really see like when you're seeing him night after night after night after night and seeing him constantly creating when a huge number of his fans are so ingrained and have those albums just memorized in their head.
You know what? He can't improvise the solo to Sweet Child. Right. Because when we play South America, every person, 80,000 people are singing the guitar solo. I mean, so you can't improvise that. But, there are sections when he does.
That's not the time to break out the whole tone scale.
Exactly. Did Joe clue you in on the whole tone?
That's not the time
yeah. That's not the time to experiment.
For people listening, when Jason and Richard and I were prepping for this interview via messages, Richard said the topics could include when to use the whole tone scale in rock and roll, and I'll let you give your own answer.
I told Joe never. The answer is never. You never use them. But I was joking, of course. I rely on that scale heavily. Not really. No.
All right. So to wrap up this episode, Richard, if you were, it seems like a lot of your, especially your childhood heroes in Thin Lizzy, it come to fruition where you're actually playing the band and trading solos with Scott. What band, if you were to like put it out there into the world and it's gonna come together someday, what band would you want to go on tour with and play guitar solos in?
Ron Wood.
Oh, there you go. That's a good one.
But I don't want him to die.
No.
It's funny because I got a call from Rod Stewart years ago. And I was like, are you kidding me? Would I want to play with Rod Stewart? Of course I would. Rod's going to play rock and roll again. And they're like, well, we do play some rock stuff. And this was Chuck Kentis, the musical director. And he's like, but, then we put on tuxedos and we do the standard stuff. And I was like, oh, well, why are you calling me? He's like, well, you can do that. And I'm like, I can, but I mean, that I don't know. I was so excited to play Faces stuff. Oh my God.
That would have been killer. Cool.
That would be the gig.
All right. Well, Richard's going to join us the rest of this week. We have a couple more fun topics coming up this week. So thanks again, Richard, and we'll see you guys later this week.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.